Give yourselves a round of applause for being part of it.
Hi everyone, my name's Grace Reeder and I'm really excited to have you all here this afternoon to discuss our mutual love of cannabis and how we can build a more equitable industry, especially here in the district. This year marks 7 years since Initiative 71 was passed, and we've consistently seen DC voters be left behind from reaping the benefits of cannabis tax revenue in this multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry. Our panel today will cover the connection between recreational cannabis and racial justice, DC statehood, and the economic impacts of cannabis prohibition. So I'm really excited for this panel, so I'm going to introduce our panelists. Today we're going to hear from activist and rapper M1. Bo Shuff of DC Vote. Seema, a local attorney and social equity activist. Chris Baker, former NFL player for the Washington Redskins and social equity advocate. And Queen Adesayu of the Drug Policy Alliance. So we're really excited for this conversation. So I'm going to ask Bo the first question today. How is the fight for DC statehood connected to the issue of recreational cannabis?
I can either give a short answer or a long answer. Since it's getting later in the afternoon, there's music playing. We'll start with the short. They are intrinsically aligned. The only reason that I71 exists and the only reason we don't have full legalized cannabis in the District of Columbia is our lack of statehood. There is no other way to talk about it than just those two things are so intrinsically linked. Quick answer. I can go longer if...
Yeah, we have lots of time.
That's the policy answer, but the cultural answer is even more important to me, and it really gets to sort of the roots of cannabis illegal policies all over the country. The roots of both statehood and cannabis policy, marijuana policy, are in racism. If we're going to be completely blunt and forward on it, that's the root of it. The reason that we don't have representation in the district and power in the district is that we are a majority black and brown district. The reason that we do not have legalized marijuana across the country is that right now the regime is such where white people get away with using pot and black people don't. So why would you change that if you are the party and the group in power when it benefits your constituency? So there's the nice polite answer of we don't have one because the other, but the roots of it all the way down are to racism and the vestiges of slavery and the vestiges of this constant need to suppress other people.
And if I can just jump in, also how this played out is that in 2014, when Washingtonians voted for Initiative 71, which was the initiative that would legalize cannabis, Congress, particularly Representative Andy Harris from Maryland, so if there's folks from Maryland here, Andy Harris is the lead champion as to why DC is not able to regulate cannabis. So right after Initiative 71 passed, he introduced a rider, which is basically an amendment to the spending bill, and the spending bill is what funds the whole government. So this is a huge package that Congress has to pass every year in order to not have a shutdown. So whenever you see a shutdown happening in Congress, it's related to the budget. So because DC is not a state, Congress is able to regulate DC's money through the federal spending bill because they have control over DC's money, basically. So Andy Harris is able to introduce an amendment to the spending bill with no accountability to Washingtonians to try to block regulation. So the amendment says that DC is not allowed to use local funds to decriminalize, regulate, or reduce criminal penalties for any Schedule I drug. So that's what Andy Harris introduced and successfully has been able to pass every year since Initiative 71 passed. So the only way for us to actually have regulation in DC is to either lift the rider or actually just have statehood. So this has been a continued fight that DPA and other folks, including DC Vote, have been trying to get Congress to address. But because mainly Republicans don't have accountability to Washingtonians and they frankly don't actually care about DC, they're able to use DC as a political playground. So hot button issues, they tend to try to control DC on. So there's an abortion rider, there's a gun control rider, blocking DC from doing anything related to those issues through our money. So I just wanted to add in a little bit more background.
Thank you very much. All right. Yeah, give a round of applause. And feel free to take notes just for yourself because this is some of the best information and most qualified information that you'll get about this issue. This is up-to-the-minute information on DC policy, which is bigger than DC policy. All right? It affects the country. So, next question for Chris. As a former NFL player for the Washington football team, have you noticed that cannabis policies have changed, or have they, and if so, how, in the NFL?
I believe they completely changed. When I played, we all used to get drug tested. And that was like the scariest time of the year, especially for guys that used to smoke weed or do weed in the league. So every year you would see and hear about guys who smoked weed and missing 6-8 games, getting fined huge amounts. And it was just crazy. Like when you think of guys like Josh Gordon, who pretty much his career was robbed because he wanted to smoke. And that was so negative. You know, he lost so much money. But now I feel like they have a better understanding of the benefits of weed. So now there's no longer a drug test. So now guys can't get suspended for smoking weed or using weed. And I think that should have been passed the whole, 30 years ago, you know.
So is there any retribution that the NFL looks to give players like Ricky Williams or Josh Gordon who got penalized for cannabis?
I wish I could sit up here and say, hey, all the guys who they suspended for smoking weed, why don't you give them back all the fine money? I'm not sure what their answer is to that. Josh Gordon, he got robbed in his prime of his career. Like, he could have went out and you see guys signing $100 million contracts at his position, and when he was in his prime, he could not play just because of being suspended for weed. And there were so many other guys. Ricky Williams, everyone knows that name. So I'm hoping that they're changing their viewpoint on it. They're not suspending guys anymore. They're finding ways to put money into the study of marijuana to see how the healing benefits can help the guys. Because you guys are probably aware, but a lot of the guys in the NFL are all under some type of medication. Everyone's taking some type of anti-inflammatory medication. And then when you're done and retired, these guys are having liver problems, they're having so much heart failure, you name it, they're having it, but they've been under medication every day of their career. So now they're finding ways to, become holistic and find ways to, for marijuana to help them deal with the pain and the anxiety and all the different things that comes with playing football.
Awesome, thank you.
Correct.
Do you think that has to do at all with the growing popularity and support for cannabis legalization as the NFL changes their policies? Is that more in line, or?
I think so. I mean, how can you tell the guys in the state where it's legal at that they can't smoke weed? I mean, it's legal in the state. It should be legal for the football team that plays in that state. Yeah. So I think they kind of have no choice but to go with looking at it in a bright view, because every state is going to legalize it at some point. So
awesome, thank you. So this question, next question is for Seema. I think it's really important to understand as we talk about legalizing recreational cannabis in DC and the barriers to legalizing fully and having a regulated market. It's incredibly important to understand Initiative 71 and the gifting economy and kind of where that came from and how it's developed over the last 7 years. So if you could just provide your perspective on your journey in DC with legalization.
Thanks for the question. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay. I'm gonna run you through a really quick history with many of you know about because you are a part of, but I think it's important for this conversation here today. Back in 2013, most people in DC did not want cannabis to be legal. They didn't want to change anything about the cannabis economy, not in any real numbers. It was like 30% support for changing cannabis laws. So why did that change? We looked at 10 years of arrests, and what we found was basically black people were the only people, by and large, who were being arrested for cannabis, for marijuana. And we went around and talked to young people, people of all ages, all across the city. And the real issue that we found was that cannabis was being used to stop and frisk black folks across the city. There are 5 major universities here, but college students weren't getting arrested or stopped or frisked at all. So cannabis was only illegal for black Washingtonians. When we decriminalized, the law was so specific here. It was the first time that anyone in the country had changed the cannabis laws because they were racist. That hadn't happened before. Cannabis laws changed because they said, well, cannabis is safe. It's safer than criminalization. But the DC law was changed because the way it was applied was racist. Let me give you an example. Young people could get a possession with an intent to distribute around sharing cannabis in a cipher. Or cops would walk up to someone and say, I smell cannabis and so therefore I'm gonna stop and search you. So piece by piece, we wrote a law that eliminated all of the different elements that were being used to criminalize black Washingtonians. And when that bill passed, it eliminated 99% of the arrests in DC. Shortly thereafter, a couple months later, Initiative 71 passed. Initiative 71 passed with 70% of the vote. So what that means is it basically took the decriminalization law and it expanded it, all of the different elements. And the product of having the gifting economy here in DC is a direct response to what DC residents not just asked for, what they demanded. 70% in politics, that's unanimous, damn near. So the idea that a DC councilman would now go try to introduce a bill to undo what DC residents asked for is the most abhorrent and offensive thing I have ever heard. Not just because the gifting economy is largely participated by black Washingtonians, not just because of that, because this is the only cannabis law in the country that was a direct response to the racial war on drugs. You hear what I'm saying? Yeah. So when we talk about the gifting economy, and I'm gonna stop because there's a lot of people here who know a lot more about the details of this industry, but I just want to say this because I work on the political side, right? From my perspective, and y'all tell me if I'm wrong, I think that the cannabis industry is the only real opportunity we are going to have in this generation to transform the economic conditions of black Americans. 100%. You hear what I'm saying? 100%. This is it. It's happening right now. In this country, there are only 2 ways that wealth is created. Not just in theory, I'm saying in real life. It's either legislated or it's inherited. You hear me? It's either legislated or it's inherited. This cannabis economy is going to be so profitable. And the idea that black Americans are not at the center of it would make no sense in the interest of where we've been progressing over the past many hundreds of years. I'll say this. We are a lot of times disappointed by representatives who come from our respective communities. But I would argue that black Americans are in a better political position than they have been since Reconstruction because of the ways in which laws in this country are made. At the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, there are more black elected leaders than there have ever been before. And what that means is that when they collectively bring their power together, those black caucuses, they can basically stop any agenda from happening. The one thing is that we haven't organized money in the same way, and that's an opportunity for the cannabis industry. So I don't want to go on and on about it, but I will say this. Everything we want that we envision about an inclusive economy, about an inclusive business structure, we can create that right now. All of these industries, the tech industry or the building industries of any kind, they're created through law. People go in and rig those systems to support their values that they believe in. If the cannabis industry is to be representative of a more humane vision of what we want, what we're looking for, the time to do it is right now. It is not too late. So I might be yelling into this mic because it's kind of loud in here, but I hope you hear what I'm trying to say.
Excellent. Can I go ahead, chime in?
I want to add one more piece to the enforcement side of this. At the end of the day, both the Initiative 71 shops and all of the legalization scenarios that exist across the country are still in violation of federal law, right? We need to root that because the enforcement maintains the racial roots that we saw even before that legalization in states or the Initiative 71 work here in the district. And that presents a massive risk. And what we're looking at right now, to build off of what you were saying, is the opportunity to build either an inclusive economy or to fall back into racist enforcement. And so now is really a pivotal time in the district especially, and why statehood and full legalization is required in order to keep, in addition, like let's think about 2 senators from the district and their votes on national legalization. Where would that go? Like, that's the easy part. But now is an inflection moment, and those folks who care about cannabis policy need to get involved at that level.
Yeah. Hey, that was excellent. Thank you very much. You know, the next question is going to go to our panelist M1, but you know, ironically, this is bigger than hip hop, right? So for those of you all who are familiar with Dead Prez, when they came out with their first album, the single from it was "It's Bigger Than Hip Hop." It's hip hop, and it was a big deal, but they were really saying it behind the chain. It was really something that now we're able to enact. So the question that I have for you, how do you define social equity in the cannabis industry, and why is it so important building equity into cannabis law from the start rather than coming back around and correcting it later? Why is that important?
Wow. Well, first of all, I want to say, like, I love the tone and the intention in the words that have been spoken here from the panelists. There is a general consensus that there's like a unanimity around how this has to change. And I live in DC. I'm not from DC, but in each place that cannabis is emerging as a phenomenon, it has a different complexion. Here, I'm loving to hear what this fight means versus statehood, and how legislature has everything to do with politically, like how we make this thing happen. But the elephant in the room that has been stated is that the reason why there has to be equity or social equity, even when you use the term, it's like righting a wrong. It's almost like balancing something that's unbalanced. And the reason why we have to do that is obviously because this system is built off oppression and exploitation of African people and brigandage and bondage. It's been stated here, which has, like Seema said, enforced their policies that they brought into the legislature that are racist, because they're built off the same exploitive analysis. The only way we can do it is deconstruct the system. I know it sounds crazy, but you know, I think we have to think as revolutionaries. This is our revolutionary moment. This is where we can emerge and do something and recreate something that hasn't been here before. And that, as a cultural worker, activist, artivist, rapper, whatever you want to call it, you know, our job is to magnify what we see and what we've heard culturally, so it makes a difference. So when we go through our day, we can sing that anthem or sing that mantra and dance and move to that. It becomes part of our, ethos in life, if you will. So I don't digress. I just have to say the root of what we're talking about with social equity has roots in revolutionizing the same capitalist structure that America was built on to begin with. That might sound like dogma or whatever, but the reality is that is the truth. And like Seema said, for African people or black people or brown people or so-called, you know, the people who've been on the bottom and who paid the price, this is the moment to stand and deliver. This is why so many people who have been in that smoke-filled room in hip-hop and rock and roll and reggae and jazz now are more important than ever. This is where we were criminalized before now, and now this thing is celebrated. So let's talk about the intention of social equity. Yes. The importance is, you know, I represent an organization called Urban Aroma. It's where cannabis meets culture, meets activism. So, you know, this is where we say, if there's going to be an exchange for cannabis, it's going to benefit political prisoners or people who are doing time because we paid the most price. Or if there's going to be exchange in cannabis with one another, it's going to happen with a passing of information as well. It ain't just about, we're just going to get high, because we've been doing that a long time, and we've seen the complexion of what this industry, what cannabis looks like, and believe me, the narrative does not include us. It has not included us. So our intention is that if we're going to build companies now, they have to be about strengthening the whole, empowerment. And if we don't do that, then you tolling the bell and doing the same history that we're trying to overturn. So that's my long and short of my answer. But I'm happy to be here on this panel. I think it would be more interesting to have the people who are resisting these policies here to talk to us, because there's a general hegemony that we down with what we're saying in the room. I want to hear why is there so much resistance to this. And so, yeah, I just want to say thank you for having me. And
Thank you for that. I did want to jump in also, just to add in this framework. Like, when I think about cannabis legalization, I try to think about it on two tracks. When we talk about racial justice, when we talk about equity, I'm thinking about rectifying the harms of criminalization, which is separate than the industry. Like, you could be harmed by marijuana's criminalization and have no interest in owning a dispensary. Communities have been ravaged by criminalization. You know, when we talk about stop and frisk, when we talk about generations of people who have incarcerated parents because of cannabis, people who have lost their children because of cannabis. I'm glad we did have the opportunity to talk about the impact of cannabis on sports, but that's one of many impacts. Yeah. People have been deported because of cannabis. You know, people have been denied public benefits. People have been evicted because of cannabis. So one track in terms of racial justice is accounting for those harms, making sure they don't continue, and the best that we can, rectify those harms. It's hard to rectify the harms of separated families, but the most we can do is make sure it doesn't continue. Separately is the industry side, making sure that the industry that's born of this advocacy is equitable, right, that it's representative of the people who really bore the brunt of the harm. When we talk about the majority of people across the country, it's even higher in DC, but the average across the country is that black people are 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis. In DC, it's up to 9 to 10 times more likely. With that consideration, I think that's why it's really disturbing to see DC Council continue to try to pass on an emergency basis enforcement before we actually had a fruitful opportunity to discuss what enforcement should even look like. Every other state, especially states that have passed legalization through legislation, have been able to have public hearings, to have neighbors contribute to what enforcement can and should look like. We can have the conversation about regulations. That's what people want. That's what Initiative 71 was supposed to be. But because of Congress, we're not able to do that. So instead of continuing to try to pass emergency legislation, I would like to see DC Council and other DC policymakers do more at the forefront of trying to push Congress to lift the rider. There's lots that they can do, and not to say that they're not trying, but they can do a lot more, to say the least.
That was such a good point too, and I think it really leads into our next question, which is actually for you, about what are the key differences between decriminalization and legalization, not just in regards to cannabis, but as broader drug reform as a whole, especially in DC.
Yeah, so oftentimes people use those words interchangeably. So decrim is not the same as legalization, which has some nuance difference between regulation even. So decriminalization basically is just removing criminal penalties. When you decrim, you're not actually establishing a regulated market. So it's okay for you to be, you won't face criminal penalties for being in possession of cannabis. but decrim by itself does not allow for legal access to sale or purchasing. So that's why decrim is not really enough. When we're talking about ending the harms of marijuana prohibition, decrim does not go far enough. I'm from New York, and New York had effective decrim since, what, the 70s? Right. And I grew up in a city that was ravaged by stop and frisk. People were in and out of prison because of cannabis. Decrim is not enough. Regulation is the ideal situation. It's where we can actually have laws in the book towards public health, making sure that we can establish a market that's safe for people. We can have consumer protection. And frankly, speaking to the conversation about DC, we have the opportunity to talk about what the racial justice side should be, what the economic justice side should be. How can we prioritize formerly incarcerated people in Washington, DC in this market? How do we make sure that people are no longer drug tested when they're giving birth and losing their children in hospitals in DC, which happens to black parents in DC disproportionately? We have the opportunity to actually talk about the promises of Initiative 71. Like Seema said, the racial justice aspect, the racial disparities, the actual impact of criminalization itself is what led the success of Initiative 71. So we should have the opportunity to talk about this and through public hearings, through the process, the democratic process that we have. And again, we have to continue to fight Congress because they are literally stopping us from doing this, even though several states have been able to do it. And the only reason why we can't do it here is because DC is not a state.
Thank you very much, Queen. Okay, so everybody sitting here might be a little wowed by the politics of it all. You have a hobby, you have a lifestyle, you have a medicine, you've been affected. But the big question for everyone, and this is when, you know, if people have ideas in the audience or right here, the big question is, where do we go from here? What now? What step can we take? What step are you going to take? I have a saying, if you think you should do something, do it now. Okay, so what do we do now?
I'm not going to answer that question, but I do want to say something else.
Okay.
And then I'll pass it to others to answer that question. When Queen was talking, it just reminded me, and I know Zach was at the center of a lot of this, but when we decriminalized, which led to the legalization in DC, we did the hearing at Anacostia Library. Have y'all been down to Anacostia Library? And everybody came out of the buildings and into the street and packed the library. It wasn't a bunch of political people. It was regular people came. This was their idea, their law. So yes, Andy Harris is out of pocket, but the idea that Mendelson, who is elected by the residents of this city, has the audacity to override what they explicitly asked for, it's just, it blows my mind. And I've been really out of this cannabis game since we legalized, and to come back and to see what's happening, it's insane. And so I say that all to say, you have so much power right now. If you are a consumer of cannabis, if you own a small business, there is no industry yet. You could form associations, you could organize your money. Like, let me just tell you this, how little black political dollars are organized. In 2014, out of the 500 top political donors in this country, only one was black, only one. There is a vacuum in terms of organized black political dollars. And I'm not suggesting that we just spend money and become consumers in the political process. Because just because you have money does not mean you have power, right? If you just spend your money, you become a consumer. But if you come together and you decide this is what we want, this is what we demand, whether it be for criminal justice reform, to bring people home, or for climate, or for anything. You have so much power right now. In 5 years from now, the circumstances will be different. What you do today will determine how much power black Americans have in this industry and in this country in 5 years from now and in 10 years from now. Do you feel me?
Yeah.
Do you think I'm exaggerating or is it for real?
100% no.
You agree, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So for those of you who couldn't hear her,
Let me take everything that you said, repeat it because it's 100% correct, and expand upon it some. It is an election year at the district level. It is an election year at the national level, federally. When we achieve legalized cannabis in the district, I have some bad news. It will cost a little bit more because of taxes, right? Part of this is that we are going to tax it. I want you all to start taxing it now on your own and take that money and spend it on making it legal. As an individual, as an organization, as a corporation, as a business, whatever you are part of is exactly right. You have power collectively. I have to throw a disclaimer really quick. I'm the executive director of DC Vote. We are 501c3. We do not advocate for or against the election of any specific individual to a specific office. But I can teach you how to get involved in the system. There is, all of the elections are coming up. All of these elections are based on the people who show up. Whether you show up with a check, whether you show up with your feet, whether you show up online, whether you show up on Twitter, whether you show up on text messages. I'll give you an example. Every donation I make to any candidate is either $5.10 or $51 because it sends a statehood message without me saying a word. I think there's a number in the cannabis industry that sort of everybody knows that maybe we could pass along a similar model, right? However you can get involved, get involved. Leverage your own individual power. I was served as Mayor Bowser's campaign manager 8 years ago. We did not talk about cannabis in that campaign. Make that change. Whether that's the mayor's race, the city council races, or federal races. The number one impediment to legalization in District of Columbia right now is not Andy Harris. It is President Joe Biden. He is the one who left the rider in the federal budget. He is the one who put it back in. We were told this from the Hill. It came out of Eleanor Holmes Norton's mouth directly on Chuck Todd. If Joe Biden isn't with us, we don't need to worry about Andy Harris. And he's not with us because we're not making our voice loud enough, and we need to continue to do so. That happens at the ballot box, and it happens at the donation table leading up to it.
Thank you very much.
If I can add, Biden is definitely one of the biggest bad actors here in terms of like where we are and trying to lift the rider. But I also would add in the Republican leadership on the Appropriations Committee in Congress. They are also responsible for it being added back. We've made some progress over the years in terms of trying to lift the rider in different ways. But I think when we ask the question of what can you do, this is just such a complicated issue because of the fact that DC is not a state. So, you know, for folks who are in the room who are not from DC, talking to your member of Congress is how you help DC. Because they don't have accountability to Washingtonians, they're accountable to you though. So, you know, if your member of Congress is on the Appropriations Committee, talk to them about why their committee is blocking DC from being able to regulate. Stand for DC.
You know, I just want to add too, like a lot of times we talk about the lack of DC statehood and it can make you feel really powerless. But I would argue that when you sit on the outside of a system, there is a lot of power there. Like, look what we did with Initiative 71. Look what you did with the gifting economy. Look at your ingenuity, your creativity. Look what you've done that no one in the country has done. When you sit outside a system, you have the opportunity to say the truth, to just speak the truth because you're not as tied in to all the benefits and privileges of being inside that system. So yeah, DC isn't a state. I'm a Washingtonian and my kids are as well. But why don't we envision that as a way in which we are more powerful? We have nothing to lose. We should just go for the entire goal. Like, yes to licenses, but I'm saying want more. You know what I'm saying? Like, don't just want a job or a business. Want intergenerational wealth. Want the ability to know that when I look at my kid, that her grandchildren are going to be okay. That if things go wrong, that they're going to be okay. We don't even know enough that we should be able to want those things. I'm suggesting, as the folks are on this panel, is want more. You know what I'm saying? You hear me? Okay.
I definitely agree, and I think the one thing that came out of the rider blocking regulation is that we've been able to watch all these other states regulate and try to get at social equity. So, you know, when it comes to social equity, we're literally like flying a plane while building it. Like, social equity is, you know, a principle, but it's something that we're literally still trying to figure out. So that's why it's really important that states that have legalized have data so we can see what's working, what's not, because if the intention is not being met, you know, it doesn't really matter. If people are not really feeling the impact of your advocacy, it doesn't really matter what, like, the framing of how we got there. So, you know, we've been able to watch so many states, and like Seema mentioned, I think it's really important that DC owns the fact that DC led the way for marijuana legalization through a racial justice lens. There was no state, there was no place that cared enough about racial justice to censor it in their campaign and censor it in what they demanded. So we have the opportunity to learn lessons from other states that have already tried this. Illinois, New York, California. There's a lot of lessons learned in California. So we should take those lessons, dream even bigger, and demand those things from DC Council. That's what they should be focusing on. How do we figure out equity when we actually have the opportunity to? When the rider's lifted, when we get statehood, whatever comes first, what are we gonna do to make sure that we can censor those who really were impacted by criminalization in DC? How do we censor Native Washingtonians? How do we censor formerly incarcerated people? That is the thing that we should be focusing on.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have one, just an action step, a call to action, somewhat they should reference. M1, we'll start with you. If there's one jewel that you could leave the audience with who's sitting there like, okay, I'm hyped up, I want to do something. We had a couple great suggestions, but now, you know, if you're really interested, which you are because you're here, take a note. What's one thing that we can do? Where can we find information? One simple thing that'll stick to us.
From where I sit, you know, amongst these brilliant minds and leaders, you know, I'm gonna put it like this, you know, hip hop, let the poppers pop and the breakers break. It's like, we gotta let the leaders lead. We gotta, I think this conversation has been fruitful to me because in New York, we are able to watch what's happening in DC. And from that standpoint, we are, I mean, the terrain is different, but we are stronger together. So, in a nutshell, I would say, to add on and echo the powerful words of all of these panelists, is we have to collectivize. We have to organize in a generational way, and see how that will be our impact. That should be our intention. So that's what I would say. That's what I'll leave you with.
Bo? Thank you.
Take out your phone right now, open up text messages, send a message to 52886. The message just needs to say 51ST, 51st.
Repeat that number again, please.
Yep. Take out your phone. I can see you all, right? Like, I can see what you're doing. So go ahead and hold up the phone.
This is you making an impact right now.
You're going to either pretend to do it or you're going to go along with it. And I'll incentivize you further. If you do it, we'll give you 10% off at 2 of the different booths. Don't remember which ones, but it will give you the email when you get it. So take out your phone. Send a text message to 52886. That's the number. Pretend it's like mom, right? And the word just needs to be 51ST, 51st. That's going to give you a petition that you can sign. When you sign the petition, you'll get an email that gives you 10% off at 2 of the different booths. I don't remember which 2, because that was Kelsey's job, because she's brilliant.
Thank you, Bo. Seema?
One thing, well, I would say yes, organize and set forth a clear statement of your values, and then hold every single move you make to account to that set of values. You hear what I'm saying?
Yes.
Dispassionately. Decide what you want and then relentlessly go after it. Be offended when elected leaders anywhere get in your way. Do you hear me? Be offended by that. You should be. If people are being elected in Washington, D.C., it's one thing for Congress not to care about what we think. But the audacity that someone elected, that we elected here, isn't listening to us, be offended, organize, demand something.
Yeah.
And I'll leave you with this too, because I'm a lawyer, right? And one thing one of my mentors told me early on, when I asked her a question about how we could use the law to unravel people from the criminal justice system, you know what she said? She said, Seema, I don't fucking know. It's all made up, right? And that was really helpful to me. Like, actually, this is all made up. Every time people want to come and take away what belongs to people, they use the law and policy and regulations to justify things that don't make any sense. But this law here in DC, this law was created by the children, by the young people, by the residents of Woodland Terrace. The law that we're under now on cannabis was created by them. So that's why it makes so much damn sense. So don't get intimidated by folks in power who try to act like a law that doesn't honor and dignify the folks in Washington. Sorry, this was not the assignment. The assignment was the next step. Sorry.
Just
Okay.
drop a jewel. Just something quick. We want to do something tomorrow or today. So just give us one thing just something we can run with and actually do from or look up from where you see.
Just go on and follow I71 Committee on Instagram. You can do it on Twitter, I believe, too. And you guys will be up there with all the latest information that you guys need to do to help get things passed in law here in DC. But just go out and vote. I mean, that's the biggest thing I learned from today. Go out and vote. These people represent you. So if there's things that you guys want to get passed, the people who you put in office are supposed to help make that happen. So organize, get out and vote, and let's make things happen.
Thank you, Queen.
If I would add something, I would add for folks who are living in DC, reach out to your ANC commissioner, in addition to your council member. When you're trying to do more organizing work in DC, I think it's going to be really important to make sure you're tackling all the elected officials, and technically ANC commissioners are also elected neighborhood representatives. So meet with them, be honest with them about what you support and why you support it, and urge them to also support it and do what they can to help advance it. So that's just one thing I think you could do. Look up your ANC commissioner.
Let's get a round of applause for this esteemed group. Our freedom and our peace is ours if we decide to fight for it. So everybody, I would like for you today to understand that you must do something for things to go your way. If you have no other idea after we had all these suggestions, follow us, I71 Committee on Instagram. Look it up on the website, I71 Committee. And, you know, make sure you have fun today. Thank you very much for coming out, and good night.